Rabbi Tovia Singer is famous for criticizing Christian beliefs in the Bible, but I want to show you an example of how he distorts the Bible so people reject Jesus. This is from his call-in show. Let me play a short clip so you get the flavor of what's happening.
But that James doesn't agree with other books. Of course they don't agree with each other, because these are all books written by different people who held different Christologies, completely different views that completely contradict the other.
So I'm going to show you how to address many of the claims in his video. He talks about the New Testament writers contradicting on whether Jesus was God. I'm also going to show how something he says about James backfires too. This video I'm engaging with started with a question. Listen to the question.
I was always taught that Jesus was God made flesh, that he had all full power and authority was given to him. I think it's in Colossians 2 and 9. But also, one of the main things that we hear about Jesus is that just like us, he was, tempted by the devil for 40 days and for 40 nights. Well, a glaring error in that, I found out, is that if Jesus was God made flesh, and if he had all power and authority of God like it says he does, in the book of James, in the first chapter, verse 13, he talks about that God can't be tempted, nor does he tempt others.
So the caller has a reasonable question. It's easy to think people are always attacking Christianity from negative motives. Some have genuine questions they would like answers to. The caller's confused. Jesus is God. We know he's tempted by the devil, but James says God can't get tempted with evil. How does that make sense? I'm going to answer that, but I want you to hear Rabbi Tovia Singer's response first.
Where do we start? Right. So Jesus in the wilderness, tempted by the devil in the Synoptic Gospels. So the notion that the Word became flesh is not in the Synoptic Gospels. That passage is from the prologue of John 1:14.
The rabbi doesn't answer about James at the start, but decides to discuss some other things first along the way. Let's deal with his first distortion of the Bible. He said the notion that the Word became flesh is not in the Synoptic Gospels. That is from John 1. Let me unpack that, because there's a lot there. The Word who John says is God in his Gospel became flesh. Rabbi Singer says this teaching is not found in the Synoptics. Whenever you hear the word Synoptics, this is talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a technical term which refers to seeing similar things. Those three Gospels are very similar and cover much of the same stuff. They have different stuff too, but it's like watching a movie from three different angles. Anyway, the rabbi says these three Gospels don't teach that the Word became flesh. This is a big distortion of the Bible. They all do, and it's emphatic. I was thinking about this. The only way he would be right is if he meant they don't use the literal words, the Word became flesh. But that's not what he means, or what viewers would take from what he's saying. Because if I say to you now, "Hi, my name's Israel, I'm a Bible teacher," then after you watch this video, you send it to a friend and say, "I watched this video from a man named Israel, he teaches the Bible." That sounds accurate, right? But then I turn around and say, "No, I never said I teach the Bible. I said I'm a Bible teacher." That doesn't make sense, does it? Because they mean the same thing. This is what it's like when people say Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't teach the Word became flesh. They all do. They all teach Jesus is the God of the Old Testament who took on flesh. Let me give you three examples. Example number 1 is from Mark chapter 1. Mark 1 verse 1-3 says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, which shall prepare your way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his path straight." Mark opens his gospel quoting 2 Old Testament verses about God, and he applies them to Jesus. By doing this, he is saying Jesus is the God of the Old Testament who was coming to save his people. Jesus is God, or the Word made flesh. Before God came in those passages, a messenger would come. According to Mark, that messenger is John the Baptist. In Matthew 1, like Mark, he mentions Old Testament passages and applies them to Jesus as well. In Matthew 1 verse 23, for example, it says, "Behold, a virgin shall be with child, and shall bring forth a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. Matthew says Jesus' name is Emmanuel because God is with us. That sounds like Matthew believes Jesus is God, the Word made flesh. In Luke 1:17, like Mark and Matthew, Luke refers to an Old Testament passage and applies it to Jesus. This is the angel Gabriel speaking about John the Baptist to his father, and he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elias to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. I did a whole live stream on this passage, showing why, even though some try to say this passage is not about Jesus, it is. Verse 76 of the same chapter says the same thing anyway, and it's clear in that verse it's about Jesus. These are some quick examples from the Synoptic Gospels. These are all in the first chapter. There's more examples in them all. But the rabbi was laughing as he started talking about this stuff, like it's laughable. But these are serious matters. When I talk about the Old Testament, I take care, and you should too. Our words have influence. When I make these videos, I'm very aware my words have influence. I don't want you to go astray. But this is such a glaring mistake Singer is making. But listen to what Rabbi Singer says next about the ancient times of the past.
This notion that Jesus was divine, again, be careful. In the ancient world, you could be God, but you're not God. Big difference. You could be God, divine, but you're not Zeus. It's very important. There was a tiering of the gods.
Nobody should deny there are tiers of gods in the ancient world. People call different people gods. Emperors get called God, key individuals too, but this is not what the New Testament writers were doing. We know this because for a Jew, there was one God. They are quoting the Old Testament passages about the one true God and saying this is Jesus. It's clear this is either true or blasphemous. There was no middle ground for how pagans spoke about deities. Everything in the New Testament gets grounded in the Old Testament, not pagan practices. Rabbi Tovia Singer may believe that or want his viewers to believe that, but that's not true. Let me slow things down for a second. Rabbi Singer thinks John is borrowing from a different writer, Paul. He thinks Paul exalted Jesus to God and John is copying him, but the other Gospels are not. Listen to what he says here.
Very intriguing that Paul gives us a fairly high Christology. Paul's letters are all dated to the 50s, and that high Christology that we find in Paul's letters are not to be found in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who did not have that Christology. They didn't have that high Christology, but we again find it in the book of John.
I've already shown how all the Gospels align in the teaching Jesus is God. By admitting Paul teaches Jesus is God, he shows there's a common thread through Paul and the Gospels. He did talk about one of Paul's clearest passages about Jesus being God in this video. His interpretation was not the best, but I'm not going to cover it in this video for sake of time. The point Rabbi Singer is trying to make is there is a development in the writings in the New Testament. For years, people have argued like Rabbi Singer. They say Mark doesn't show Jesus as God like John does. So their theory is as time is passing from Mark to John, Jesus now becomes God, meaning the traditions got exaggerated. We used to play the telephone game. You hear a message and then you tell someone, and by the end it's something completely different. That's the point they are making. This does not make much sense though. If Paul writes first and teaches Jesus is God, then the synoptics don't teach this. Then John teaches this. This isn't development. Paul is the spanner in the works for their theory. It sounds good in theory, but when we examine the claims, it doesn't survive even a little bit of pressure. The development theory doesn't hold much weight, but the rabbi gives an example of why it does.
So John is picking up on Paul, whereas the synoptics are not. Another example of that, just one other example of that, is that Jesus is the Lamb. So we find that in 1 Corinthians 5:7 as an example. He's our Passover, and then we find that in John, but it's completely absent in the Synoptic Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Some of these statements are mind-boggling to me. Let's start by reading this verse in 1 Corinthians he mentioned to see what it says. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. This verse says Christ is the sacrifice in our place. This again is like the Bible teacher example I gave you earlier. Let's look at an allusion to Jesus being the sacrifice in Matthew 1 verse 21. And she shall bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Jesus will save people from their sins. Matthew alludes to Jesus being the Passover lamb here. Then he develops this through his gospel. Look at Matthew 8, verse 16 to 17. When the evening was come, they brought unto him many that were possessed with devils, and he cast out the spirits with his word, and healed all that were sick, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, himself took our infirmities and bear our sicknesses. Jesus is the one who takes the sicknesses, the diseases, and cleanses us. He's the Passover lamb that saves by his blood. In Mark 10 verse 45, Jesus says this, for even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. His life's given as a ransom, a payment for others. This is all Passover language. Another passage you could look at is Mark 14 verse 24, which is even clearer. Luke talks about Jesus as the Passover during their Passover meal. In Luke 22 verse 19 to 20 it says, and he took bread and gave thanks and brake and gave unto them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me. Likewise also the cup after supper, saying, this cup the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you. This is all Passover typology and reference. Jesus' blood saves like the lamb's blood did in the first Passover in Exodus. Rabbi Singer goes on in the video to reject this passage as not genuine. Some argue this passage isn't because some manuscripts don't have these verses, but these verses are in manuscripts in different parts of the world. It's much harder to get scripture in different places like this if it's not genuine. Now Rabbi Singer tries to steer the ship back to the original point about James, but says one more thing first.
Getting back to your point, these books didn't read each other. I mean, Luke didn't read Matthew. If he would have written his infancy narrative somewhat differently, wouldn't he have?
Luke opens his gospel by saying other people have written gospels before him. Based on history, Matthew and Mark are clear examples of this. It's easier to argue for development when you have authors unaware of each other. Rabbi Singer gives an example of the two birth stories of Jesus in Matthew and Luke. I won't cover that here because I did a whole video on this, engaging with Dr. Bar Ehrman making this argument previously. The rabbi gets back to James now, and this is what he says.
Who wrote James? Now, you're quite right. Whoever wrote the book, his name could have been James. He says he's James. Who wrote it? I don't know. But he had a very different view than Paul did, right? As far as being observant, keeping commandments. And when James said, let no one say when he is tempted, and I'm tempted by God, because God cannot be tempted with evil, and therefore he doesn't tempt anyone. So it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit because it's a completely different author with a completely different view, utterly different view.
James and Paul go hand in hand when you understand who they are writing to. James is encouraging believers to live godly. Love fulfills the law. This is the same thing Paul says to believers. Paul's letters, like Romans, are also for people who are not believers though. Once you understand this, there's no contradiction or problems. I want to play a clip that highlights the point Rabbi Singer wants to get across. He mentions James saying God is not tempted one last time here.
It's not a departure from Judaism. It is in a rebellion against the prophets of Israel and the God of Israel. And that's why you have this highly variegated theology rather than one that's consistent. I mean, how could God be tempted? How ridiculous.
I want to make 2 points. First, as Christians, we don't believe Jesus gets tempted as God. He became flesh, and his human nature gets tempted, as passages like Hebrews say. But he was sinless. Christians believe in Christ's 2 natures. That's why he's the God-man. In Genesis 18, God appears to Abraham. Some Jewish commentators talk about God visiting him as he recovered from circumcision. But God in that passage appeared as a man. He walked, he ate, he drank, he was in a finite location. He appeared to Abraham in a physical location at his tent door. We can't turn around and say, how could God eat or drink or walk or be in one place? He did this because he appeared in this form for his own reasons. That did not stop him from being God. In the same way, God in the New Testament takes on flesh and eats and drinks, etc. Second point is, James believed Jesus is God too. In chapter 2 of his letter, he does the same thing the gospel writers do. He calls Jesus the Lord of glory. This is a title for God alone. This kind of verse would remind a Jew of passages like Psalm 29. Look at how the psalm begins. Give unto the Lord, O ye mighty, give unto the Lord glory and strength. Give unto the Lord the glory due unto his name. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. The voice of the Lord upon the waters. The God of glory thundereth. The Lord is upon many waters. The more you understand the Old Testament, the clearer you see what the disciples are doing in the New Testament. That's why you should watch my video next on what many Jews get wrong about Jesus. God bless.